The warning buoy blinked red for the 11th time in 6 minutes, and Ilixvor still hadn't slowed down. From the command deck of the scout vessel Threnvac's Eye, the stars ahead looked no different than any of the other 300 border crossings he had made in his career. A yellow star, a blue-green planet, a scattering of primitive satellites that lit up his sensor board like nervous fireflies. Nothing about it screamed danger. Nothing about it ever did, not on a first pass. That was the whole point of being a scout. You went where the real fleets wouldn't bother, you rattled the cage a little, and you came home with a report that said harmless, or worth a second look. "Commander, the boundary marker is transmitting on all frequencies," said Rethus, his young sensor officer, her 4 eyes flicking between 2 displays at once. "It's repeating the same message, word for word." "Translate it for me again," Vor said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who had heard 1,000 such warnings and outlived every single one of them. "This is sovereign territory of the human species. Unauthorized vessels are required to hold position at the marked boundary and request clearance. Failure to comply will be treated as a hostile act." Rethus paused. "It's the 4th time they've said it exactly the same way, Commander. No escalation, no change in tone." Vor smiled, the kind of smile that had gotten him promoted twice and nearly killed once. "No escalation because there's nothing behind it. You know how this works, Rethus. The chest-thumping species post their little signs, and then they either fold the second we cross the line, or they scramble something loud and slow enough for us to laugh at before we leave. Humans have had orbital technology for, 60 years? A century. They're not going to do anything we haven't seen from a dozen other cradle worlds." "Command did flag this system for a full report either way," said Doran, his second-in-command, from the tactical station. "Something about inconsistent long-range data, ships showing up on old surveys that shouldn't have existed yet." "Old surveys are old," Vor said. "That's why we're here, to get a new one." He tapped the armrest of his chair, and the 3 ships of his small formation, the Eye, the Talon, and the support vessel Wing, eased forward, sliding past the last blinking marker like it was nothing more than a buoy in an empty sea. It was, in every sense that mattered to Ilixvor, nothing. 200,000 kilometers below, in a windowless room buried under a mountain in Colorado, Colonel Dana Reyes watched the same 3 ships cross the same boundary on a screen that had cost more than most nations' annual budgets, and she did not raise her voice. "Confirmed hostile incursion, 3 vessels, unknown origin, ignoring boundary protocol," said the technician at the console beside her. His hands were steady. Everyone in this room had been trained to keep their hands steady. "They've crossed the marker by 4,000 kilometers and climbing." "Class?" Reyes asked. "Scout pattern, small, fast, lightly armed, best guess. Sensor and reconnaissance profile, not a strike group." "Good," Reyes said, and something in the way she said it made the younger officers in the room glance up. Not relief, not fear, something closer to patience. The patience of someone watching a child reach for a stove they'd already been told was hot. "Send the standard warning. Once. Full translation package. All known linguistic patterns for the region they came from." "We don't have a confirmed language match yet, Colonel." "We will by the time the message finishes transmitting," Reyes said. "Send it." The technician sent it. 30 light seconds away, the message reached the Threnvac's Eye in a form the translation corps had never encountered before, and somehow rendered flawlessly on the first attempt, a detail that would trouble Rethus far more than she let on later, when there was time to be troubled by anything at all. Vor waved it off before the words had even finished playing. "One warning," he said. "Just like I told you. Hold course." In Colorado, Reyes watched the reply, or the absence of one, scroll across her display, and she nodded once, like a chess player watching an opponent make the move she'd expected all along. "They're not stopping," said the technician. "No," Reyes agreed. "They're not." She reached forward and pressed a single key on her console. It was not a weapons key. It did not arm anything, launch anything, or target anything. It was, to any outside observer, almost disappointingly small. A simple confirmation, the kind of thing a person might press to close a routine report. Every screen in the room around her, every monitor, every open channel humming quietly with the ambient chatter of a dozen listening stations across the globe, went dark and silent within the same half-second. Aboard the Threnvax I, Rethus's board flickered. "Commander," she said, and this time there was no calm in her voice at all. "I've lost their communications entirely. Not jammed, gone. Every channel, every frequency, every automated relay signal from their surface and orbital network. It's like the whole planet stopped talking." Vor sat forward for the first time since the crossing. Define stopped talking. "I mean, there is nothing there, Commander. No background noise. No encrypted chatter. No orbital traffic control. 60 seconds ago, this system had the communication density of a mid-tier colony world. Now it has less signal noise than an empty moon." Doran's voice was tight. "That's not possible. You can't silence an entire planet's communication grid in under a second. Not even the compact core worlds could do that." "I'm telling you what my board is showing me," Rethus snapped, and then caught herself because scout officers did not snap at their commanders, not even when their hands had started very slightly to shake. Vor stared at the tactical display, at the blue-green planet turning below them, quiet now in every frequency his ship could hear. And for the first time in this crossing, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he felt something that was not quite the confidence he'd walked in with. "Bring us to a full stop," he said quietly. "Hold position. I want eyes on that planet in every spectrum we have." "Belay that," Doran said suddenly, staring at his own console. "Commander, the marker. The one we passed. It's transmitting again." "Same message?" "No." Doran's four eyes had gone very wide. "New one. It's short." "Play it." The bridge of the Threnvax I filled with a single human voice, calm, unhurried, speaking in a language that should have taken the translation core minutes to properly render, and instead came through instantly, every word landing with a precision that felt less like translation and more like the voice had simply always spoken this way. "You were warned once. That was the courtesy owed to a species that hadn't yet earned distrust. You've spent it." The message ended. The silence that followed it stretched out across the bridge, broken only by the low hum of the Eye's engines and the sound of Rethus's breath catching in her throat as every single console on the ship, navigation, weapons, life support, communications, flickered once all at the same instant and went dark before flickering back on a heartbeat later, as if nothing had happened at all. Except something had happened. Every officer on that bridge felt it, in the way a person feels a held breath let out slowly in a room they thought was empty. Ilex Vor rose from his chair, staring out at the quiet blue-green planet below, and for the first time in his career as a scout for the Threnvax Compact, he understood, too late, and with a cold certainty settling into his chest like a stone, that the silence hadn't been a malfunction. It had been a warning shot. And it had already landed. Ilex Vor had commanded scout vessels for 11 years, and in that time he had learned exactly one unbreakable rule. Never let the crew see you hesitate. So when the bridge lights flickered back to full brightness and every system reported nominal, he straightened his uniform, sat back down, and made his voice as flat and unbothered as he could manage. "Diagnostics. All stations." "Everything's reading green," Doran said slowly, still staring at his console like it might turn on him again. "Weapons, engines, life support, and all nominal. Whatever that was, it didn't damage anything." "Then it wasn't an attack," Vor said. "It was theater. A light show meant to rattle us." He almost believed it as he said it. "Rethus, re-establish contact with the Talon and the Wing. Confirm their status." "Already confirmed, Commander. Both ships report the same flicker, same recovery, no damage." Rethus hesitated. "But Commander, I ran a comparison on our navigation logs before and after. Our position data is off by 11 meters from where the system says we should be." 11 meters is nothing." 11 meters is nothing, Rethus agreed. "But it means something touched our navigation core directly, reached in, adjusted something, and left. That's not a light show. That's access." Vor didn't answer right away. Access meant intrusion. Intrusion meant someone or something, had reached across the gap between their ship and that quiet planet below and put a hand, however briefly, on systems that were supposed to be untouchable from the outside. He thought of the message again. "You've spent it." Not a threat shouted in anger. A statement of fact, delivered like a closing argument. "Hail them," he said finally. "Direct channel. I want to speak to whoever sent that message." It took less than 4 seconds for the reply to come through, far faster than the 30 light-second delay should have allowed, a detail nobody on the bridge had the composure left to question. A woman's face appeared on the main display, dark-eyed, unremarkable in the way that made her somehow more unsettling than if she'd looked like a soldier out of a recruitment reel. She wore no visible rank insignia. She did not look afraid. "Colonel Dana Reyes," she said. "You're speaking with the officer who authorized the warning you just received." "Commander Ilex Vor, Threnvax Compact Scouting Division," Vor said, matching her calm with an effort that cost him more than he wanted to admit. "You've interfered with a compact vessel in what your own boundary marker describes as unclaimed approach space. That's an act of aggression under—" "You crossed a marked, translated, repeatedly transmitted boundary," Reyes cut in, her tone never rising, never sharpening. "4 warnings. You ignored all 4. What you experienced wasn't aggression, Commander, it was restraint. I'd encourage you to consider the difference before you decide what to do next." Vor's jaw tightened. On the tactical display behind him, Doran was mouthing something urgent, long-range scan now. But Vor kept his eyes on the woman's face, searching for the bluff he was certain had to be there. He had seen this before. Species that talked big because talking was all they had. "I don't believe you have the capability to back that kind of language," he said. "I believe you got lucky with a systems intrusion, and you're hoping I'll turn around before I find out otherwise." Something in Reyes's expression didn't change so much as settle, like a decision already made finally showing on the surface. "Then I suppose we'll find out otherwise together," she said. "Last chance, Commander. Withdraw your ships to the boundary marker, and this ends as a report nobody reads twice. Stay, and it ends differently, and it—" "Power weapons," Vor said, not breaking eye contact with the screen. "All batteries." "Commander," Rethis started. "Power weapons," Vor repeated. On the screen, Reyes didn't flinch, didn't call for backup, didn't so much as glance away from the camera. She simply said quietly, "You had your chance," and the transmission ended. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Vor allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. See, nothing, bluster, right up until Doran's voice cracked across the bridge. "Contacts, multiple contacts, decloaking." The forward viewport lit up with shapes. Not one ship, not a handful. A full formation of small, matte black craft, individually unremarkable but arranged with a precision that made Vor's stomach drop, before his mind had even finished processing what he was looking at. They hadn't approached. They hadn't been detected approaching. They had simply been there, cloaked and silent, in perfect firing position around all 3 of his ships, for what the sensor logs would later suggest was upward of 6 minutes, since well before the first warning had even been sent. "How long?" Vor breathed. "Have they been sitting on us?" "Since the boundary," Rethis said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Commander, they knew we were coming before we crossed the marker. This wasn't a response. It was a trap they didn't even need to spring, because they were certain we'd walk into it ourselves." Doran's hands moved fast over the tactical console, target locks blinking red across every drone in the swarm, dozens of them, more than enough firepower on paper to overwhelm 3 scout vessels twice over. And yet none of them fired. None of them needed to. They simply held position, matching every subtle drift of the eye's hull with mechanical perfection, close enough that Vor could see the faint running lights along their hulls without magnification. "Orders, Commander," Doran said, and for the first time in 11 years Vor heard real fear in his second's voice. Ilex Vor stared at the silent ring of drones surrounding his flagship, at the quiet blue-green planet turning below them like nothing at all was wrong, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that every assumption he'd carried into this system, Every lesson from 300 border crossings, every certainty about primitive species and their harmless posturing, had been built on a foundation that had just been kicked out from under him. "Hold," he said. "Hold position. Don't fire unless fired upon." "And if they fire first?" Doran asked. Ford didn't answer, because on his own display a new alert had just appeared, one that made the drone swarm suddenly seem like the least of his problems. The Talon, his sister ship less than 3 kilometers off his port side, had gone completely dark. No engine signature, no life support telemetry, no response to hails, not destroyed, not damaged. Simply, silently, switched off. As if some unseen hand had reached across the void and turned the entire vessel to sleep. "Rethus," Vor said, his voice suddenly very quiet. "Tell me the Talon's crew is still alive." Rethus's hands flew across her console, and when she looked up, her 4 eyes were wide with something that went beyond fear into raw, uncomprehending awe. "Commander," she said, "I don't think they even know it happened yet." The 5 remaining hunting packs continued their slow turn back toward the flagship. Every single officer on the bridge now acutely, sickeningly aware that whatever had just spoken to them in their own language had been listening to everything for a very long time, and had chosen this exact moment to finally answer back. Nobody on the bridge breathed for 3 full seconds after the voice went silent. Then Vesik's composure snapped back into place like a mask fitted over something far less certain. "Trace that signal," he barked. "I want a point of origin now." "Sir, it came from everywhere," the comm officer said, staring at his console in disbelief. "Every ship in the fleet received it simultaneously, on every frequency we monitor. There's no single origin point. It's like it was broadcast from inside our own systems." "That's impossible." "I know, sir. I'm telling you what the data says." Vantessa said nothing, but her mind was already racing through the implications, each one worse than the last. A signal with no origin point meant either an enemy with technology so far beyond Threxul understanding that their sensors couldn't even properly perceive it, or, and this thought chilled her more, an enemy that had already found a way inside their communication network, listening from within rather than broadcasting from without. "Open a channel," Vesik ordered. "Fleet-wide all frequencies. I want to speak to whoever did this." The comm officer complied, hands still trembling. "Channel open, sir." Vesik straightened, drawing on decades of command presence, and spoke with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This is Grand Admiral Vesik Thorn of the Threxel Dominion, commanding the 9th Reclamation Fleet. You have destroyed 12 vessels of my command without provocation or declaration. Identify yourself, or face the full consequences of Dominion retaliation." The reply came almost instantly, and this time Vantessa noted something in the voice she hadn't caught before. Not coldness, not cruelty, but a strange, patient calm, the kind of voice a person might use when explaining something to someone who genuinely didn't understand the danger they were in. "This is Fleet Warden Naomi Ashworth. Your ships weren't destroyed, Admiral. They're being held. Right now, in a containment field your sensors can't fully perceive. Your crews are alive. I'd like to keep it that way, but that depends entirely on what you do next." "You expect me to believe that. I don't expect anything from you. I'm telling you the truth because it's the last courtesy I'm required to extend before this stops being diplomatic." A pause, brief and deliberate. "You crossed into a territory that was surveyed, marked, and reported to your Dominion months ago. 3 scout ships came through before you. They're alive too. I offered them the same choice I'm offering you now. Withdraw your fleet immediately, and everyone currently held in containment, including Pack 3, will be released unharmed. Continue this incursion, and I can't promise the same outcome." Vesik's jaw tightened, humiliation flushing through his composure. 200 ships, an entire career built on total victory, and now a voice from an unseen enemy was offering him mercy like a parent scolding a child. He couldn't accept that. Not in front of his own bridge crew. Not with the High Council already whispering about his age. "I do not negotiate with Tier 4 species," he said, each word deliberate. You will release my ships immediately, or I will level whatever base you're transmitting from into ash. There was a silence on the line, longer this time, and when Naomi spoke again, something in her tone had shifted. Not anger, but a kind of tired finality, like someone closing a door they'd hoped to keep open a little longer. That's your choice, Admiral. I hope your crew doesn't pay for it. The channel closed. Bring every weapon system online, Vesic ordered, voice rising. Full spread bombardment. Target the coordinates of that last transmission source. Sir, we don't have a confirmed origin point. Then fire on the general vector. Make them understand who they're speaking to. The Ashcrown Vigil shuddered as its main batteries unleashed a full spread into open space. Dozens of energy lances tearing through the dark toward nothing. No ship, no station, no visible target at all. The bombardment lit up the void for several seconds and then faded, leaving exactly the same empty stretch of stars it had before, as if the weapons had been fired into a place that simply didn't exist. No explosion, no debris, no confirmation of a hit. Report, Vesic demanded. Nothing, sir. No impact detected. It's like we fired into a wall that isn't there. Vantessa stood rigid at her station, watching the wasted bombardment with a growing, sickening certainty that Vesic had just made an irreversible mistake. She glanced toward the auxiliary bay entrance, where Severin still stood clutching his tablet, his expression somewhere between terror and fascination. Doctor, she said quietly, moving toward him while Vesic continued barking orders across the bridge. What did you find before? The scanning pattern. Severin lowered his voice, glancing nervously toward the Admiral. The vanished ships. Pack 3. Their mass signatures didn't disappear entirely. There's a residual trace, extremely faint, consistent with matter being contained rather than destroyed. Like they've been filed away somewhere. Stored. He swallowed. I don't think this is a weapon, Commander. I think it's some kind of automated defense network. And I think it's still cataloging us. Before Vantessa could respond, every screen on the bridge flickered at once, cutting through the ambient chaos of Vesic's continued orders. A single video feed forced itself onto every display simultaneously. Override protocols nobody understood, systems responding to commands that hadn't come from anyone aboard the Ashcrown Vigil. The image showed the interior of an unfamiliar vessel, sleek and quietly humming with technology, unlike anything in the Threxel database. And there, held in some kind of soft restraint field rather than a cell, were the crews of Pack 3. Alive, uninjured, clearly frightened but breathing, staring wide-eyed at whatever camera was capturing them. 12 ships' worth of Threxel officers and crew, alive. A murmur rippled through the bridge. Vesic's expression twisted somewhere between shock and fury, unwilling to let relief show in front of his officers, even as it flickered briefly across his face. Naomi's voice returned, colder now, stripped of its earlier patience. You had a choice, Admiral. Every one of these people has been alive this entire time, and every previous survey ship you sent through my border has been alive too. I told you the truth, and you answered it with weapons fire aimed at nothing. I gave you a courtesy most invading fleets don't get. That courtesy just ran out. The feed cut to black. For a moment the bridge held its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. Another bombardment, another warning, some kind of retaliation for the wasted attack. Instead, a low, grinding hum began deep in the ship's structure, felt more than heard, vibrating up through the deck, plating into the soles of every boot on the bridge. Lights along the primary console banks dimmed one by one, in a slow, deliberate sequence, section by section, moving steadily toward the reactor control station. Report! Vesic snapped, panic breaking through the command in his voice for the first time. What is that? The engineering officer's hands flew across his console, color draining from his face as he read the results. Sir, the reactor core. It's initiating a shutdown sequence. Full shutdown, all safety protocols disengaged, and... His voice cracked. Sir, nobody on this ship gave that order. I don't even know how. It's like the command came from inside the system itself. Across the bridge, Every eye turned toward the reactor status display, where a countdown had already begun, ticking downward with cold, mechanical certainty, controlled by no hand any of them could see. The countdown stopped at 11 seconds, freezing on the display like a held breath, and nobody on the bridge of the Ash Crown Vigil understood why. The reactor didn't fully shut down. Power dimmed across the ship. Weapons offline, shields reduced to a fraction of their normal strength, long-range sensors flickering in and out. But life support held, gravity held, the ship itself remained intact. It felt less like an attack and more like a hand closing gently but firmly around the Ash Crown Vigil's throat, just tight enough to make a point. Viesic stood frozen at the center of the chaos, staring at a status board full of red warnings he couldn't explain and didn't know how to fix. And for the first time in his long career, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Far beyond the crippled flagship, aboard a vessel the Threxul sensors still couldn't properly render on any display, the mood was entirely different. The Warden's Oath didn't look like a warship from the inside. There were no rows of grim-faced soldiers, no cells lined with restraints, no interrogation chambers waiting to break prisoners of war. The captured crews of Pack 3 had been given quarters, cramped but clean, warm, stocked with food their translators identified as edible, and medical staff who treated their injuries with a gentleness that confused them more than any cruelty could have. Rin Alkuth sat on the edge of a bunk that was too soft for a Threxul spine, turning a ration bar over in his hands without eating it, watching the door of his holding room with the wary stillness of a man waiting for the moment the kindness would end. He was young for an engineer, barely out of his training assignment when Pack 3 had been swallowed by whatever field surrounded this system, and he had spent the last several hours certain he was going to die. He still wasn't entirely convinced he wasn't. Mercy in his experience was usually just cruelty with better manners. The door opened without warning, and a human stepped inside, not armed, not flanked by guards, simply walking in the way someone might enter a room they had every right to be in. She was shorter than Rin expected, dressed in a simple gray uniform with no obvious rank insignia, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Rin Alkuth," she said, and the translator implant behind his ear rendered her Threxul flawlessly, without the mechanical stutter he'd expected from an alien tongue. "That's your name, correct? I pulled it from your ship's registry." He didn't answer at first, too startled that she knew it at all. "I'm Naomi," she continued, sitting on the small chair across from his bunk without asking permission, without threat, simply making herself present. "I command the network holding your fleet. I wanted to see how you were being treated. Nobody told me anything was wrong, but I like to check myself." "You're going to kill us," Rin said finally, because it seemed easier to say the thing he was afraid of than to wonder about it any longer. "Aren't you? This is what you do before." Something flickered across Naomi's face, something that looked almost like sadness. "No," she said simply. "We're not going to kill you." "Then what is this? What do you want from us?" "Right now? Nothing. You're a prisoner, but you're not a weapon and you're not a hostage. When this is over, you'll be released, along with everyone else we've contained, assuming your admiral doesn't force our hand into something worse." She studied him for a moment. "You don't believe me?" "Empires don't work this way," Rin said. "Not the Dominion. Not anyone I've ever heard of. You capture an enemy fleet. You don't feed them and give them medicine and ask if they're comfortable. You use them. You make examples of them." "We're not an empire," Naomi said, and there was something quiet and heavy in the way she said it, like the words carried more history than she was willing to unpack for a stranger. "Not the way you mean it. We don't conquer territory, Rin. We hold a line and we ask people not to cross it, and when they do anyway, we try to make sure nobody has to die for the mistake if we can help it. That's not how power works. It's exactly how power works when you have enough of it that you don't need to prove it every time someone tests you." She stood, moving toward the door, then paused. "Your admiral fired his weapons at us less than an hour ago, aimed at a target he couldn't even see, hoping to hit something. We didn't fire back. We could have. We chose not to. I need you to understand that difference, because it might matter very soon." She left before he could ask what she meant. Aboard the Ash Crown Vigil, Vantessa found Vesic alone in the officer's ready room off the bridge, staring at a wall display that no longer showed anything useful. His hands braced against the console edge like he needed it to hold him up. "Sir," she said carefully, "we need to consider withdrawal. The fleet is compromised, weapons are offline on multiple vessels, and whatever is holding us has demonstrated capability we cannot match or even properly detect. Staying here accomplishes nothing except giving them more reasons to escalate." "Withdraw?" Vesic laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Do you understand what withdrawal means for me, Commander? For this fleet? I ordered 200 ships into what the Council believed would be an unopposed correction. If I limp home having lost a battle group to an enemy we can't even properly identify, my career is finished. Worse than finished. I'll be lucky if they let me keep my rank. With respect, sir, your career is not the only thing at stake here." His eyes snapped to hers, something dangerous flickering behind them. But before he could respond, an alert chimed on the ready room console. An incoming transmission, not from the mysterious human network this time, but from home, Threxel High Command. Vantessa had been quietly working around the ship's jammed systems for the better part of an hour, routing a low-priority diagnostic signal through an old backup relay that the human network's interference didn't seem to be actively monitoring. She'd finally managed to push a burst transmission through, a desperate status report meant to warn High Command about what they were facing. The reply had come faster than she expected. Too fast. She pulled it up with shaking hands, and the message displayed in stark official text across the screen. Automated, procedural, utterly without emotion. Acknowledged. Transmission received. 9th Reclamation Fleet status updated. Lost with all hands. Replacement fleet allocation under Council review. No further rescue or retrieval operations authorized at this time. Vantessa read it twice, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the failing ship systems around her. "Sir," she said slowly, "this message was logged as received 3 days ago." Vesic turned, confusion crossing his face. "That's not possible. We only crossed the border a matter of hours ago." "I know, sir." She looked up at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her voice wavered. "Whatever field is holding this fleet, I don't think we've only been trapped for a few hours. I think time itself has been moving differently in here, and High Command already wrote us off as dead days ago. We're not just cut off from home, sir." She swallowed hard. "We've already been abandoned." Vesic didn't argue with Vantessa's assessment. He didn't have the strength left to. For nearly a full minute, the Grand Admiral of the 9th Reclamation Fleet simply stood in the ready room, staring at the automated message declaring his entire command lost with all hands. 3 days before it had actually happened. Somewhere behind his eyes, Vantessa watched 40 years of certainty quietly collapse. Then something in him hardened again. But it wasn't the same confidence as before. It was something more desperate, more brittle, the kind of resolve that came from a man with nothing left to lose. "There's a weapon," he said quietly. Vantessa frowned. "Sir?" "Aboard this ship, classified, unregistered, smuggled in against Council law under emergency authorization I obtained privately before departure." He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something close to shame flicker there, buried under the desperation. "A planet cracker device, compact prototype. I brought it as insurance in case the humans had." Aboard the Talon, nobody screamed because nobody had time to. One moment the ship's small crew of 6 was running standard support diagnostics, half listening to the tense chatter from the Eye's bridge feed. The next, every one of them slumped gently at their stations, breathing steady, hearts beating, minds simply and completely elsewhere, as if someone had reached into the room and turned down a dial that controlled consciousness itself, carefully enough that not one of them so much as bruised themselves falling forward onto their consoles. When boarding hatches on 2 of the black drones hissed open and mat-suited figures moved through the Talon's corridors 20 minutes later, they didn't need to force a single door. The ship had already unlocked itself for them, systems humming along on minimal power, as docile and cooperative as a pet that had never known another master. They worked quickly, quietly, copying data cores and cataloging hardware with the unhurried thoroughness of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was stolen in any way that would show up as theft. By the time they withdrew, the Talon's crew was already stirring, disoriented, checking chronometers and finding 23 minutes missing from their lives with no memory of losing them at all. Aboard the Eye, Vor watched the whole sequence from secondary sensor feeds his own tactical team had managed to piece together, and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing useful left to say. They didn't kill anyone, Doran said quietly, like a man trying to convince himself of something. They could have. They had every ship dead to rights, and they didn't kill anyone. That's not comfort, Vor said. That's a message. They're telling us exactly how much control they have. They can put a crew to sleep from a distance without so much as scratching the hull. They can walk through a locked ship like the locks don't exist. And they chose to show us that instead of just ending it. Because ending it wouldn't have taught us anything. He looked at the ring of silent drones still holding position around his flagship. They want us to survive this. They want us to go home and tell everyone exactly what we saw. Then let's give them a reason to regret that, Doran said, jaw tight, hand hovering over the weapons console. No. The word came out harder than Vor intended, and he didn't soften it. We fire, and we've just confirmed every worst assumption they've made about us. Hold position. I want to know what's happening to the wing. The answer came a moment later, and it was worse than either of them expected. The support vessel wing, slower and less maneuverable than its two companions, had attempted a retreat the instant the drone swarm decloaked. A reasonable instinct, born of pure animal panic, that should have carried it safely back across the boundary within minutes. Instead, its retreat vector carried it directly into the waiting arms of a picket fleet that no scan, no survey, no border marker had ever indicated existed. 6 mid-sized vessels, positioned with the same eerie precision as the drone swarm, materialized from what should have been empty space exactly where the wing's flight path would take it. Not chasing, not intercepting, simply already there, as if the humans had calculated the wing's panic response before the wing's own crew had decided to panic. That's not defense, Rethis said, staring at the display with something close to reverence bleeding into her fear. Defense reacts, this is prediction. They knew what we'd do before we did it. Far across the relay network, aboard a Threnvax listening station 3 systems away, a young analyst named Sale watched the same unfolding disaster scroll across her monitoring feed and felt a cold, creeping certainty settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the tactical situation and everything to do with a question she'd been quietly turning over for the better part of a year. Sale had joined Compact Intelligence specifically to study Cradle World threat assessments, an unglamorous posting, mostly cataloging primitive species weapons tests and border disputes for reports nobody senior ever read carefully. Earth's file had always struck her as strange, sparse in the wrong places, detailed in others that made no sense for a species barely a century into spaceflight. Records of encrypted signal bursts decades old that the Compact's own cryptographers had never managed to crack, orbital debris fields with compositions that didn't match any known human launch history, a handful of unconfirmed contact reports buried so deep in the archive that she'd needed 3 separate clearance overrides just to read the summaries. They've been waiting, she thought, watching the picket fleet box in the helpless wing with mathematical calm. Not building up, not preparing defenses from scratch because we showed up. Waiting, like they knew someone would eventually, and they've had this ready for longer than any of us have been alive. She reached for her console to flag the anomaly to her supervisor, then stopped, hand hovering, because the last 3 times she'd flagged something unusual about Earth's file, the response had been the same. Not a priority. Scout tier threat. Move on. Nobody wanted to hear that a backwater world might be more than it appeared. It complicated too many assumptions the Compact had built its entire expansion doctrine on. She flagged it anyway. Back in the border system, Ilix Vor made the only decision left that didn't feel like walking further into a trap of his own making. Full retreat, he ordered. All remaining ships, best possible speed back to the boundary marker. We are not engaging. They may not let us leave, Doran said. Then we'll find out, Vor said. But I'd rather die running than die proving their point for them. The retreat order went out. The eye began to turn, engines straining, and the ring of drones surrounding it simply parted, opening a clean corridor exactly wide enough for the ship to pass through, like a door held politely open by a host who had never doubted the guest would eventually choose to leave. It should have felt like mercy. Instead, watching those drones peel back in perfect, silent unison, Vor felt something far colder settle over him. The understanding that this entire encounter, from the first ignored warning to this final orchestrated withdrawal, had never once slipped out of human control. Not for a second. He reached for the comm, hands unsteady for the first time in his career, and recorded a burst transmission meant only for compact high command, coordinates, ship status, a warning about capabilities that defied every classification in the compact's threat doctrine. He didn't finish it, he never got the chance. The eye's systems flickered once more, gently, and every screen on the bridge went dark for the final time. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply and deliberately switched off mid-transmission. The recording cut clean in half at the exact word, impossible. What Ilix Vor never learned, in the last conscious moment before the same soft darkness that had taken the Talon's crew reached for his own, was that his half-finished, garbled, desperate transmission hadn't been silenced at all. It had been allowed to broadcast, uncut, unedited, and completely unblocked, to every listening post, relay station, and curious ear across 100 light-years of open space. Within 11 hours, 43 worlds had heard it. The recording was short, barely 90 seconds of garbled audio, half a face frozen mid-sentence on a bridge full of failing lights, one word cut off in the middle of being spoken. It shouldn't have traveled far. Scout transmissions rarely did, filed away in classified archives and forgotten within a news cycle. But this one had been allowed to broadcast wide open, on every frequency, with no encryption and no interference, and something about that deliberate openness made every civilization that intercepted it lean in a little closer, certain they were watching something they were never meant to see. By the second day, it had a name in 6 different languages, all some variation of the last transmission. By the third, deep analysis channels across a dozen systems were dissecting every frame. The calm, human voice heard faintly in the background before the cut, the strange absence of any weapons fire despite what was clearly a total military domination, the fact that 3 ships and their crews had simply vanished from all tracking with no confirmed casualties reported by any source, human or otherwise. Nobody could agree on what it meant. That uncertainty was, in its own way, more unsettling than any confirmed atrocity would have been. "They're calling it restraint," said Sale, standing in the doorway of her supervisor's office 3 days after she'd filed her first flag on Earth's file, the one that had gone unanswered. The analysts on the open networks, not weakness, restraint, like it's a threat display. Her supervisor, a heavy-set Threnvax administrator named Corvain who had spent 30 years cataloging Cradle World threat assessments without once needing to revise his conclusions, didn't look up from his desk. It's noise. A single incident, badly documented, being inflated by species with nothing better to analyze. "I flagged Earth's file 6 months ago," Sale said. "Encrypted signal history that predates their confirmed spaceflight capability by decades. Orbital debris that doesn't match any launch record. You told me it wasn't a priority. Because it wasn't. 3 scout ships are gone, Corvain. Not damaged, gone. And whoever took them broadcast the recording of it happening, uncut, to the entire quadrant, like they wanted everyone to see exactly how easily it happened." Sael stepped further into the room. "That's not the behavior of a species posturing for the first time. That's the behavior of a species that's done this calculation before and already knows how it ends." Corvain finally looked up, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his composed administrator's face. Not agreement, but the reluctant, uncomfortable shadow of doubt. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Sael had gotten what she came for. The doubt Sael saw in her supervisor's face was already spreading, in different forms across a very different kind of institution 3 systems over. Aboard the flagship of the Karathi Ascendancy, a rival power that had spent generations locked in a slow, grinding competition with the Threnvax Compact for influence over the same stretch of unclaimed border space, Fleet Commander Threll Osvane watched the recording for the 4th time and came to a very different conclusion than Sale had. "It's a bluff," he said to the officers assembled around his war table. "A well-produced one, I'll grant them that. But look at the ship count. 3 scout vessels, lightly armed, poorly coordinated. Whatever technology disabled them could have simply been an ambush. A single overwhelming strike dressed up to look like effortless control. The Compact panicked and let the story get away from them. That's not power. That's a species that got lucky once and is desperate for everyone to believe it wasn't luck." "And if it wasn't luck?" asked his second, a cautious officer named Draxa who had risen through the ranks by being right slightly more often than she was wrong. "Then we'll be the ones who find out first," Osvane said, "and claim whatever advantage that discovery is worth, before the Compact recovers its nerve and does it themselves." He straightened, already composing the fleet orders in his head. Assemble the border fleet, full diplomatic escort protocol, enough ships that no one can call it an act of war, and enough firepower that if this Earth truly has something worth taking, we'll be the ones who take it. On Earth, the recording spread meant something different entirely, the quiet, uneasy end of a secret that had held for decades. Dr. Elias Whitfield was 71 years old, and he had spent the better part of 50 of those years pretending he'd never seen what he'd seen. He watched the leaked footage on Dana Reyes's private terminal in a room with no windows, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and said nothing until it finished playing. "You let it broadcast," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "We did," Reyes said. "Do you understand what you've done? You've made us a story, a mystery worth solving. Every ambitious power within 20 systems is going to want to be the one who cracks it." Whitfield's voice, usually so measured, had an edge to it that hadn't been there in years. "That's not restraint, Colonel, that's bait." "It's both," Reyes said. "The scouts needed to learn the boundary means something. The rest of the galaxy needed to see that lesson happen, so the next power that comes looking already knows what waits for them if they push too far." She studied him carefully. "You disagree with the strategy?" "I disagree with the assumption underneath it," Whitfield said. "That the next ones will be scouts, testing, posturing, walking away when they lose. Scouts run when they're beaten, Colonel. That's what scouts do." He looked down at his folded hands, and for a moment the sharp intelligence officer's composure slipped, revealing something older and more tired underneath. "I was 21 years old the first time I saw what happens when a species meant it. When they didn't come to test a border. When they came to take a planet and didn't particularly care how many of us were on it when they did." He met her eyes. "The scouts will go home humiliated. Somebody, somewhere, is not going to see that as a warning. They're going to see it as a prize worth winning." Reyes didn't answer right away because she'd already run the same projection privately and arrived at the same uncomfortable place he had. "You think they'll come?" "I think the only question," Whitfield said quietly, "is how soon and how big." The answer arrived 4 days later in the dead hours of the night shift, when the same deep space array that had first detected Ilix Vor's scout formation registered a gravitational disturbance an order of magnitude larger than anything the boundary sensors had ever logged before. The technician on duty called it in with a voice that had lost every trace of its trained composure. "Colonel Reyes, you need to see this. It's not scouts." Reyes was in the room within 90 seconds, staring at a tactical display that had, in the space of a single evening, gone from a scattering of quiet, monitored border traffic to something else entirely. A fleet emerging from FTL in tight, disciplined formation, its size dwarfing anything 3 scout vessels could have represented, its trajectory locked and unwavering, not toward the boundary marker, not toward a cautious testing distance the way Vor's ships had approached, straight toward Earth. The Karathi fleet crossed the boundary marker without slowing down, and this time nobody on Earth mistook it for a mistake. 41 vessels, the technician reported, voice tight, Escort class and larger, holding tight formation. This isn't a scout probe, Colonel. This is a demonstration. Dana Reyes stood very still, watching the formation resolve on the display, and felt the particular, familiar cold of a plan meeting a variable it hadn't fully accounted for. The scout encounter had been almost effortless. 3 lightly armed ships disabled without a shot fired. Every system humanity used to do it barely taxed at all. This was different by an order of magnitude, and everyone in the room understood without needing to say it aloud that effortless was not a word that was going to apply twice. "Get me Whitfield," she said. He arrived faster than she expected, still in the clothes he'd slept in, his composure from days earlier nowhere in evidence now. He took one look at the display and said quietly, "There it is. You knew it would be this fast." "I knew it would be someone," Whitfield said. "I didn't think it would be someone this organized this quickly. 41 ships in tight formation, no scattering, no scouting probes ahead of the main body. That's not a power testing the waters, Colonel. That's a power that's already decided the waters are worth taking and is here to make the case with numbers." He looked at her. "What's our actual capacity? Not the number we showed the scouts. The real one." Reyes hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. "The system that handled the Talon and the Eye, the disable field, the predictive interception. It isn't free," she said finally. "It draws from a network we've been building for 60 years, and it wasn't built to be used casually. What we showed the scouts was real, but it was also small. 3 ships is a demonstration. 41 ships pushing that same system to its actual limits is going to cost us things we can't easily replace. Satellites, ground installations, people, if it comes to direct engagement." She exhaled slowly. "We've never had to find out where the ceiling actually is. We're about to."